My name is Claire, I am 29 years old, and I am a stay-at-home mom. My husband Julian is 32 and a senior executive at a large company. We live in Nice, a city where the sun shines almost all year round, but where I often feel alone, trapped in the daily routine of being a mother and wife. Julian works long hours, and although he provides for all our material needs, he is increasingly absent emotionally and physically. Our relationship has lost its warmth and spontaneity, and I am beginning to feel the weight of monotony. Our house is located in a quiet neighborhood of Nice with a stunning view of the Mediterranean Sea. The children, Elise and Maxim, are in school all day, which leaves me a lot of time alone at home. I've always loved my role as a mother, but lately, I feel like an invisible, unrecognized shadow. Julian comes home late at night, often exhausted, and our conversations are limited to banalities about his workday or the children's homework. One day, a water leak in the bathroom forced us to call a plumber. That's how Leo came into my life. Leo is 25, tall, with tousled brown hair and piercing green eyes. He has a raw charm and attentive presence that starkly contrasts with Julian's indifference. From the first day, I was intrigued by him, by his confidence and simplicity. When Leo first came to our house, I was nervous. I wore a light summer dress and had my hair down. I tried to appear relaxed, but my heart beat faster when I opened the door for him. He greeted me with a warm smile and immediately got to work, inspecting the bathroom with expertise that impressed me. We exchanged a few words, mostly about the leak, but I was already captivated by his soft, steady voice. Days passed, and Leo came back several times to complete the repairs. Each visit became an opportunity for us to talk a little more. He told me about his projects, his passion for scuba diving, and I talked about my monotonous days at home. He listened intently, his eyes fixed on mine, and I found myself eagerly anticipating his visits. One afternoon, while the children were at school and Julian was at work, Leo and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen sharing a coffee. The conversation became more personal, and I confided my feelings of isolation and loneliness. He looked at me with a depth of understanding that deeply touched me. "I'm sorry you feel this way, Claire," he said softly. "You deserve to be happy and fulfilled." His words resonated with me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt seen and heard. This burgeoning connection made me reflect on my life, on what I had become, and what I truly wanted. Leo's presence began to fill a void I hadn't even realized was so profound. The visits from Leo became more frequent, and with them, a palpable tension arose. Each smile, each prolonged glance seemed laden with unspoken meanings. We were on the verge of crossing a line, and even though part of me knew it was dangerous, another part couldn't help but crave the thrill, the escape from routine. One day, after he finally completed the repairs, Leo suggested we go for a walk by the sea. I hesitated but decided to break away from the monotony. We walked along the beach, our feet in the sand, talking about everything and nothing. The simplicity of that moment made me forget my worries, and I felt free, even if just for a while. As the sun set, we sat on a rock, watching the waves lap the shore. "Thank you for this day, Leo," I finally said. I hadn't realized how much I needed it. He looked at me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. "I'm happy to have made you smile, Claire," he replied. And in that moment, I knew our relationship would never be the same again. After that walk by the sea, I could no longer deny the attraction I felt for Leo. Our conversations became more intimate, and each meeting was a mix of excitement and guilt. Leo had become an escape from my monotonous life, a breath of fresh air that reminded me what it was like to feel desired and alive. One morning, while Julian had left early for a meeting, Leo came to the house to check that everything was working well after the repairs. The children were at school, and we found ourselves alone once again. We sat in the living room, and the conversation quickly drifted to more personal topics. I talked about my dreams and aspirations that I had set aside for my family. He listened, his eyes shining with interest and understanding. At one point, the conversation stopped, and a heavy silence settled in. We looked at each other, and before I knew it, Leo leaned in and kissed me. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, but it awakened emotions in me that I had buried for a long time. I found myself responding with unexpected fervor. This first kiss marked the beginning of something new and unknown, something I could no longer ignore. The following days, I was on cloud nine. Every thought, every moment was occupied by the memory of that kiss and the anticipation of our next meetings. Leo and I found excuses to see each other, whether it was for a quick coffee or a discreet walk. The guilt was always there, lurking in the corner of my mind, but the desire and excitement were stronger. One afternoon, while the children were at an after-school activity, Leo invited me to his place. I knew it was a bad idea, but I couldn't resist. His apartment was simple but cozy, and as soon as we crossed the threshold, an electric tension filled the air. We sat on the couch, and before I realized what was happening, we found ourselves in each other's arms, our kisses becoming more and more passionate. Our relationship evolved quickly. Each meeting was an explosion of passion and repressed emotions. I felt alive like never before, and every moment spent with Leo was a reminder of what I had lost with Julian. But the closer we got, the more the reality of our situation hit me. I was betraying my husband, and although I tried to justify my actions by telling myself that I deserved to be happy, the guilt was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, Julian came home exhausted. I watched him, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the man I had married, the one I had built a life with. The guilt gnawed at me, and I decided to take a step back from Leo, to focus on my family. But the attraction was too strong, and it only took a few days for me to relapse. Our clandestine meetings became more frequent and riskier. We met in discreet places, away from prying eyes, but the adrenaline of the forbidden added an extra dimension to our relationship. One day, while sharing an intimate moment in an isolated park, we didn't notice the curious neighbor hiding behind a tree. His stolen photos were about to turn my life upside down. A few days later, Julian received an anonymous envelope containing photos of Leo and me. I came home to find Julian sitting at the kitchen table, the photos spread out in front of him. His gaze was a mixture of anger, pain, and disgust. My heart stopped, and I knew the moment of truth had arrived. "What is this, Claire?" he asked, his voice trembling. I had no words, no excuses. All I could do was cry and ask for forgiveness. Julian left the house that night, leaving me alone with my regrets and the certainty that my life would never be the same again. After Julian left, I was overwhelmed by guilt and regret. The children quickly noticed that something was wrong, but I didn't have the strength to explain the truth to them. Julian refused to talk to me, and I found myself alone, facing the consequences of my actions. Every day was a struggle to maintain an appearance of normality for Elise and Maxim, but inside, I was devastated. Julian hired a private detective to gather evidence against me. He wanted sole custody of the children, and I quickly realized I was at risk of losing everything. The following weeks were a whirlwind of anxiety and fear. The detective followed me, taking photos and gathering testimonies. I felt the net closing in around me. Leo was a comfort but also a source of tension. We still saw each other, but each meeting was filled with fear. I knew that every moment spent with him could be used against me. Leo tried to support me, but it was clear that the situation was overwhelming him. The passion that united us began to be tainted by a much darker and oppressive reality. One afternoon, while picking up the children from school, I noticed a car parked a little further away, the detective inside with his camera pointed at us. Anger and frustration welled up inside me. I wanted to protect my children, but I felt I was losing control. I decided to confront Julian, to talk to him, to convince him to give me a chance to make things right. I found Julian at his place, tired and suspicious. "What do you want, Claire?" he asked coldly. I was at a loss for words. I talked about our family, our children, everything we had built together. But Julian was relentless. "You destroyed everything, Claire. How can I trust you again?" His words were like daggers, and I realized how deeply I had hurt him. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings moved quickly. Julian used every piece of evidence, every photo to strengthen his case. I received court summonses, legal documents that I struggled to understand. I felt overwhelmed, alone against the world. My friends, those I thought would support me, distanced themselves, some shocked by my behavior, others simply uncomfortable with the scandal. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Each day was a struggle to keep my head above water. Leo and I continued to see each other, but our relationship was now marked by sadness and uncertainty. One evening, as we lay next to each other, Leo murmured, "Claire, maybe we should stop. All this is becoming too complicated." His words resonated within me, and although I understood his reasons, the idea of losing him was unbearable. Finally, the day of the judgment arrived. I stood before the judge, my hands trembling, my heart pounding. Julian was there with his lawyers, determined to get sole custody. I tried to defend myself, to show that despite my mistakes, I was a good mother. But the evidence was overwhelming. The judge announced his decision: Julian was granted sole custody of the children. The world collapsed around me. I returned home alone, to a house now devoid of laughter and life. The children's rooms were silent, and their absence was an unbearable void. Leo came to see me, trying to comfort me, but I was inconsolable. "It's all my fault," I said between sobs. "I've destroyed everything." The following days were a trial. I had to face the reality of my new life without Julian, without my children. Leo stayed by my side, but our relationship was no longer the same. Guilt, shame, and grief had created a chasm between us. One evening, as we sat in silence, I made a decision. "Leo, I think we need to stop. I need to focus on myself, on my children. I need to try to rebuild my life." He nodded sadly, knowing it was the right thing to do. I then began a long process of reconstruction. I enrolled in classes, looked for a job, did everything I could to regain some stability. But each day without my children was a trial. Seeing them only on weekends was heartbreaking, and I lived each moment of those visits as a blessing. Months passed, and I worked hard to rebuild my life. I found a job in a downtown boutique, and although the work was tough, it gave me a routine and a necessary distraction. Julian and I established an arrangement for the children's visits, but each meeting was filled with tension. He only spoke to me when absolutely necessary, and each interaction was cold and formal. One afternoon, while I was working, a customer entered the boutique. It was Leo. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes, and I understood that our separation had affected him as well. We talked briefly, exchanging pleasantries, but the attraction between us was still present. He suggested we have coffee after my work, and although I knew it was a bad idea, I accepted. Sitting in a small cafe away from prying eyes, we talked about our lives, about what had changed since our separation. Leo told me about his difficulties, and I talked about my struggle to find some normality. The conversation inevitably drifted towards our relationship, and before I knew it, we were kissing again. It was as if everything that separated us had disappeared in an instant. But the moment was short-lived. A neighbor of Julian's walked into the cafe and saw us. The look he gave me was enough to understand that he would talk. The fear and anxiety returned immediately. I went home with a heavy heart, knowing that this meeting would likely cause more problems than happiness. A few days later, I received a court summons. Julian was using this new proof of my infidelity to request a revision of our custody agreement. He wanted to further limit my visitation rights, claiming I was a bad influence on our children. I was devastated but decided to fight. I hired a lawyer and prepared my defense, determined not to lose any more. The day of the hearing, I stood before the judge, my lawyer by my side. Julian presented his evidence, and the image of me with Leo was projected as proof of my irresponsibility. My lawyer pleaded for me, highlighting my efforts to rebuild my life and maintain a stable relationship with my children. It was a fierce battle, and every word exchanged seemed to weigh heavily on the outcome. Finally, the judge delivered his verdict. Although my visitation rights were reduced, I did not lose total contact with my children. It was a mixed victory, but it was better than I had expected. Julian looked at me with a coldness that chilled me to the bone, and I knew our relationship was irreparably broken. The following weeks were a period of intense reflection. I avoided Leo, knowing that our relationship could no longer continue without causing further damage. I focused on my work and the rare moments I spent with Elise and Maxim. I took them to the park, we went on outings, and I tried to show them that despite everything, I was still their mother and loved them more than anything. One of the hardest moments was explaining to Elise and Maxim why they couldn't spend as much time with me anymore. Their confusion and sadness were daggers in my heart, but I did my best to be strong for them. Mom makes mistakes, I told them one evening as I tucked them in. But that doesn't change the love I have for you. The loneliness was crushing, but it also gave me time to reflect on my choices and what I wanted for the future. I started therapy, seeking to understand why I had made the decisions that led to the destruction of my family. I wanted to be a better person for my children, and that meant confronting my inner demons. One day during a therapy session, I realized that I also needed to forgive Julian and myself to move forward. I decided to write him a letter, not to justify my actions, but to express my regrets and understanding of the pain I had caused. It was a difficult letter to write, every word a struggle against shame and guilt. I didn't know if Julian would read the letter or if he would ever forgive me. But the important thing was that I was taking a step towards healing. I continued to work on myself, to rebuild my life, and to show my children that even after a fall, it is possible to get up and start over. With time, the pain began to subside. The visits with my children became more natural, and we gradually regained some complicity. Julian remained distant, but we managed to communicate more civilly for the sake of the children. I felt that I was finally regaining control of my life, even if the road was still long. One morning, as I was preparing breakfast, I received a message from Leo. He asked how I was and suggested we meet to talk. I was hesitant, but I knew that this conversation was necessary to close this chapter of my life. We met in a park, away from prying eyes. Leo had changed, he was more mature and seemed to have reflected on our situation. We talked for a long time, and I explained that although I still cared for him, our relationship could no longer continue. We have suffered too much, and it's time to turn the page, I told him. He nodded sadly, understanding my reasons. We said goodbye, knowing it was for the best. This decision marked a turning point for me. I focused on my therapy, my work, and especially on my children. Every day, I strived to show them that they were my priority. We spent precious moments together, and I began to see the fruits of my efforts. Elise and Maxim smiled more often, and I felt that we were rebuilding our relationship on stronger foundations. I also got involved in community activities, joining support groups for single parents. This helped me not to feel alone and to find comfort among people who understood what I was going through. These meetings gave me a new perspective on life and the challenges we must overcome. One day, while reading a book in the park, Julian appeared. He seemed nervous, and I sensed he had something important to say. "Claire," he began, "I wanted to talk about our situation. I've thought a lot, and I think we need to find a way to better coexist for our children." His words were sincere, and I felt a glimmer of hope. We started an honest and open conversation, the first in a long time. We talked about our mistakes, our regrets, but also our hopes for the future. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a step towards better cohabitation for the well-being of our children. We decided to establish a new dynamic where communication and mutual respect would be prioritized. With time, this new approach bore fruit. Our interactions became smoother, and we began to rediscover what had initially attracted us to each other. We were no longer the same people, but we learned to accept our differences and work together for our children. One evening, as I tucked Elise and Maxim into bed, I felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long and difficult, but I was proud of the progress we had made. I had learned to forgive myself, to accept my mistakes, and to move forward with more wisdom and compassion. The temptation of everyday life had taught me valuable lessons about human nature, desires, and mistakes. But it also showed me the resilience and capacity for redemption that each of us possesses. I knew I would never be perfect, but I was determined to be the best version of myself for my children and for myself. A year after the discovery of my infidelity, I looked back with a mixture of regret and gratitude. Regret for the pain caused, but gratitude for the lessons learned and the strength found. I was a different woman, stronger and more aware of my choices. My relationship with Julian remained complex, but we had found common ground to coexist as parents. Leo had left my life, but I wished him the best, grateful for what he had brought me. As for my children, they were my light, my motivation to keep moving forward and growing. Life continued with its ups and downs, but I now knew I was capable of weathering the storms. Each day was a new opportunity to build something beautiful and meaningful. And with the support of my family, my friends, and myself, I was ready to embrace the future with hope and determination.